Appreciate it. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Norman. I'm the director of the Child Support Bureau for the state of Indiana. And we really appreciate the invitation for us to be here today to talk about something we normally don't talk about in front of the auditors group, which is child support. And we have some things that are happening in our world that we want you to really be aware of. That's what today is about. Let me see if I'm an attorney, not a technical person. So if I screwed up, it's not my fault, right? I'm excited that we had a second break, right? So everyone's now energized a little bit with all those steps since the escalators got shut off. So that's good news for all of us. So like I said, my name's Adam. This is Joe Jean. He is our Director of Organizational Change Management for our systems project. And then John Mallers, which I'm sure a lot of you know, he's our Assistant Deputy Director for Financial Quality Assurance. So each of them is going to have a part today. And on the agenda that's up here today, we're going to talk about what INVEST is and tell you what that means. Some rollout of our new statewide computer system, about the piloting county that are, and some of the hosting of the visiting counties as well, some county visits, CP, which is custodial party, and NCP, which is non-custodial parent, a portal, which is new for us to have in the state of Indiana. Change champions and super users. This is for our new project. Change champions are basically people who are, cheerleaders, and the super users are ones who know everything A to Z of the system. Talk about some training that we're going to be starting next year in 2022. The on-site support that we're going to be providing to all the county offices, which focuses mainly on the prosecutors and the clerks. And then some discussion that might about some equipment needs that are going to be associated with this new statewide system in every county, and about web providing, and then talk about 4D incentive fund issues. That's going to be what John's going to talk about, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Joe.
So good afternoon. If some of you have been around a while, I may have been in front of you since 2008. Child Support Bureau has been talking about building a system, and we actually are doing it now. 13 years later, we're actually doing it. So in 2020, DCS hired a vendor to replace our legacy child support system that the clerks and prosecutors have been using since the early 90s, and it's based on 80s technology. So it's pretty old, and it was due to be replaced a long time ago. So we're moving from an old using F keys and that kind of thing to an actual web-based system that everybody else is used to using nowadays. And we're trying to get in front of anybody and everybody we can out in the counties who may even peripherally be affected by this project. So for county councils and auditors and things, when you see expenses come past your desk and stuff, at least give you a heads up as what is this related to. So what we're doing with this system, that we started working on it in 2020 in July. So about 3 months after we were all sent home at the state to work from home, we brought the vendor in, and we've been doing most of this work virtually because the state has not allowed us to bring our vendors back in. So even though state employees are back in the office, we're still working with these folks virtually. So for you all, what we wanted to give you an idea of the timeline of this project and when it's going to affect your particular counties. So up here right now is our rollout schedule for next year. So we have 3 pilot counties, which are Clay, Howard, and Vanderburgh counties. So those prosecutors and clerks are going to pilot the system for us. It's currently scheduled to begin the 1st of July with a 90-day pilot. And then we will start rolling out the rest of the county. As you can see from the map, we have 3 rollouts after that, in hopes to be live completely statewide by the end of November of next year. So I've put my work email address and then my team's email address too, because if there are questions that might pop up from you or county councils or anybody else in your counties, you can email me. We can email back and forth, and we're also offering to come out and talk to any group that we need to. So some highlights of this new system too that both your clerks and prosecutors are going to be getting used to is the fact that our public who uses the 4D services for child support will now have online access to a lot of their case information. So they'll be able to not just look for payments when their last payments were coming in, but appointments, court dates. They'll be able to submit and upload documents that either the prosecutor or clerk is requesting in order to work their case. The main role of some of our county prosecutors and clerks are, as what Adam mentioned earlier, are what we call change champions and super users. So these are folks that are actually in the counties working in those offices who are directly involved with our project day in and day out. So these change champions are our conduit for communication to and from their county offices. Then we have a group called super users. So these are folks who are going to get trained on everything on the system from A to Z, not just small pieces of the functionality. And they're going to be primarily the leads for those counties when they come up. And one of the reasons why we wanted to mention these two groups, especially the super users, is there's going to be training involved with these folks. And some of the training is going to be virtual, but for the super users, there may be some who will come to Indianapolis for face-to-face training, or if we do regional trainings, they may have to drive to another county to receive that. So anyone who's sees expenses crossing their desks, giving that heads up of some things that are happening starting next spring. The training that's for the prosecutors and clerks are going to be designed and specific for their particular functions. As some of you may know, the clerks don't do the actual enforcement of cases, the prosecutors do, but the clerks process all that money locally. We're also offering what we've called a sandbox, which is going to be a mirror image of the actual system, so they can, once they're trained, can go back in their office and play around the system and do some of their daily activities in a practice environment, so that they're not messing up cases or anything, so they can actually do some hands-on training in those offices. Like I mentioned earlier, Invest is going to be web-based. So one of the things that we want to make sure counties are aware of, because it's web-based, we know that there are some counties, especially if they're distant rural counties, don't have the best bandwidth and high-speed internet. And so it might require prosecutors and clerks to come to their county councils to upgrade what they have. And in our package, I just included a map to give folks an idea of who their carriers are out in those counties. So it's just a color-coded map. So before I hand it over to John, some of the expenses, like I said, are related to travel for training. Adam mentioned equipment. So Invest is going to be what we're referring to as a paperless enforcement system. So most counties do have a desktop scanner, or they have a multiple function device in their office that does scanning for them. But we've learned that a lot of our county prosecutors and clerks do not have those types of tools. So they will have to purchase especially the prosecutors will be purchasing scanners and our multi-purpose devices to scan those documents into Invest. The monies that can be used, obviously, are 4D money or incentive dollars, and I won't get into that. That's your special area. But again, my email address is on there. The team's email address is on there. We've had a few requests to come out and talk to some individual counties, and we are going to visit some of the larger counties already, like Lake, Marion, Allen, and so on, because we just need to physically see the lay of the land when we come out and do training, provide that on-site support when we're embedded there in the county when they come up live. So are there any questions now about this particular project or comments before I hand it over to John? If not, I'll keep us rolling. John?
Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate the chance to be here. my group, the FQA or Financial Quality Assurance Group, released a couple guidance documents earlier this year. One I think was in January and one maybe in July, covering incentive fund 8895, which is the Title 4D incentive fund, and then we also had one about incentive fund transfer. So I wanted to just very, very briefly go through those issues that were in those documents. So yeah, we're up there. So all right, the first thing was, obviously everyone knows there's 3 incentive funds at the county level. There's the prosecutor incentive fund, the clerk incentive fund, and then the Title 4D incentive fund, 8895. Now these are all the same money. These are all the same federal dollars. They do not require appropriation per the Indiana code that you see there, unless you're supplementing the salary of an elected official, a judge or a clerk or a prosecutor. If you're doing that, then it goes through the regular appropriation procedures. But otherwise, if it's an eligible 4D expense and you have the money in the fund, it does not require appropriation. Now, that being said, you know your councils better than I do. And a lot of councils that we've run into or that we've come across do like to appropriate those funds. So I'm not asking you to defy them in any way, shape, or form. But just technically speaking, those are the rules for those funds, and it applies to all 3 of them. Now, who can spend from Fund 8895? Well, only the offices, because the clerk fund is only for the clerk. The prosecutor's fund can only be spent by the prosecutor, but 8895 can be spent by any office that has a cooperative agreement with Child Support Bureau. So that would be your clerk, your prosecutor, and if you have a 4D court. Those are the 3 offices that can spend from that fund. Now, the auditor, we have allowed county auditors to initiate an expense just out of convenience for the cost allocation plan fee. So if the cost allocation plan, you decide you want to pay it out of incentive funds, you can do that out of 8895. That's the one and only expense that the auditor can initiate out of incentive funds. And even then, that's only if the cost allocation plan is only being used for Title 4D reimbursements. If it's being used for any other purpose, I know in the past, there's been some counties that use the cost allocation plan for a grant for, the health department or the sheriff or highway or whatever. And the plan is set up where it can show that information for other departments. If it's used for other departments, then you're going to have to allocate that cost and only pay a certain portion out of incentive funds. The rest would have to be paid from somewhere else. But if it's solely used for Title 4D, that's the only purpose of the plan, then you can pay the fee entirely out of incentive funds. Now, for the 8895 funds, like I mentioned earlier, all 3 of those offices, the clerk, the prosecutor, and maybe the 4D court, if you have one, can spend from that fund. But it's best to have a plan for how those monies are used. We've seen a lot of situations where there was one office going to use that money for one purpose and another office kind of swooped in and spent a lot of that money, created a lot of hard feelings and misunderstandings. So it's best to have a plan for the use of those 8895 funds, since multiple offices can spend from there. So it doesn't have to be anything formally written. That'd be nice if you did, but it's just an agreement, maybe get the auditor and the judge or prosecutor, clerk, and maybe a council member in a room, kind of talk about those funds, how you want to use them, whether it's allowing one office to use it. A lot of counties that have a 4D court will allow the 4D court to use that fund and nobody else. Or you want to split it a third, or anything in between is fine. It's just kind of have an understanding and agreement at the county level so people know how those monies are going to be spent. Okay, incentive fund transfers. You can transfer between incentive funds, between the clerk and the prosecutor incentive fund. Clerk's is 8899, the prosecutor is at 8897. Absolutely allowable. It's more of a convenience thing. It helps hopefully to encourage spending of incentive funds, which is always a good thing. And it also is easier from an accounting perspective. It's if the prosecutor has a project that they want and they don't have enough incentive funds, they can get some from the clerk, transfer it into their fund. That way you don't have the prosecutor spending from the clerk's fund and the clerk spending from the prosecutor's fund, and that just becomes an accounting nightmare, which I'd like to try to avoid. So ideally, if you have a situation like that, then you would use a transfer between the clerk and the prosecutor or vice versa. Those are allowable. But if you do that, you need to complete a transfer form. What's it called? A Child Support Incentive Transfer Agreement. There's a copy of it on our page on the CSR, the Child Support Resource website. And it just has information about the transferor, the transferee. The auditor needs to sign it. It has the date of the transfer, the amount of the transfer, the frequency if there's more than one. It has just all that sort of information. That document needs to be completed with any incentive fund transfer to serve as documentation for that transfer. Now, what about transfers from 8895? Well, normally, if there is no county agreement on how to spend those funds, and therefore anybody can spend from there, any of the 3 offices or the 4D offices, then no, transfers are not allowed to or from 8895. So if there is no agreement on how to spend those funds, then clerk, prosecutor, and court can already spend from there. There's no point in transferring money if you can already spend from there. It just kind of avoids that rigmarole. However, if there is a county agreement on how to spend those funds, let's say, for instance, the 4D court in a county is given those funds by agreement, well, then it becomes essentially restricted. The prosecutors, like I said earlier, is theirs. The clerks is theirs. That kind of becomes the 4D courts then. In that instance, then, if the 4D court would need some incentive funds or somebody else would need them, you could transfer to and from there, and you would use the transfer agreement in the same way as you would for clerk and prosecutor transfers. Now, transfers to county general from the incentive funds, those are not allowable. Incentive funds are federal funds. They're dedicated funds. They are not allowed to be transferred into county general. We've seen situations where a county maybe paid bonuses, but they didn't have enough money in their incentive fund. So they paid it out of county general. And then when they subsequently got more money into their incentive fund, they transferred money over to make it as though it was paid out of incentive funds, and that's not allowable at all. So transfers from incentive funds to county general is a no-no, but you can transfer from county general back into the incentive funds if you're correcting an error. Maybe something too much was paid out of the incentive fund, or during the course of one of our reviews, we see something was paid out of there that shouldn't have been, or whatever the situation is. You can restore the balance of the incentive funds that way, but you can't move incentive fund money to county general. Any questions about that? It's fairly straightforward. All right. Incentive fund transfers and the QIB. Everyone knows the QIB. Just a little bit of background. The reason the QIB was created, as you probably know, is we received an audit finding from Board of Accounts back in 2009, I think it was, stating that we weren't monitoring the expenses of incentive funds well enough. We didn't know the balances. We didn't know how much was being spent each month or each quarter by the counties. And so part of our corrective action plan was creating this form, the QIB form. And this is something that you guys, and thank you very much for doing this every quarter. You submit that with the balances of the 3 incentive funds each quarter. You also upload copies of the ledgers and the fund balance reports, and we really appreciate that. That's very helpful for us for our work. One of our duties that we do as a result of this is we reconcile these incentive funds. So all 276 of them. Every quarter we do a reconciliation. So, we have the QIB balances each quarter. So we basically have the beginning balance and the ending balance for a quarter. The distributions that go into the incentive funds come from us, so we know what those dollar amounts are. The expenses we know because you guys send us the ledgers, and so we have that information. So we have the beginning balance, the money coming in, the expenses going out, and then the ending balance. And normally that's going to reconcile. But it doesn't reconcile when there's these transfers, because these transfers are otherwise not reported in the portal. And that's why one of the reasons we have the QIB is for the reporting of these transfers, so that then when we do our reconciliation, that transaction is reported as well. And so how you report the transfer on the QIB depends on how you do the transfer. So if the transfer is by a warrant and a check, so in other words, for example, you write a check out of the clerk's incentive fund for $5,000 and you move that into the prosecutor's incentive fund as a transfer. If you write a check to do it, then that only requires one balance adjustment. And I'll show you a picture of the form here in a second. That only requires one balance adjustment because the expense out of the clerk's is going to be picked up from the ledger. So we will see that information. So we just need one balance adjustment. In the form, if you look at the first column there on the left, it's prosecutors. The first row is where you put the balance each quarter. The second row, or the bottom row, is where the balance adjustment goes. So in my example, you wrote a check for 5,000 out of the clerk's fund and moved it in the prosecutor's, we'd know about the 5,000 out of the clerk, but we wouldn't know about the 5,000 into the prosecutor. So it would be a positive balance adjustment of $5,000 that you just type right in there in that bottom left box. And then the bottom box, the big one at the bottom, is where you just do a little explanation of what it was. So if you just write a check, it's just one balance adjustment. Now, if you do a transfer through a journal entry through the software, where you just do a journal entry out of the clerks and into the prosecutors, or however that would work, then that's going to require two balance adjustments, because we're not going to know about either of those from the ledger. So in that instance, you would write a negative $5,000 in the middle bottom box for clerks and a positive $5,000 in the prosecutors. And that's how the balance adjustment would show up if that's the way you do the transfer. And with all transfers, like I mentioned earlier, if you do a transfer, we have that transfer agreement that needs to be completed. You don't need to get that to us at the time of the transfer, but when you report the transfer on the QIB, please upload a copy of that transfer agreement into the portal like you do the ledgers and all that stuff. It would just be an additional thing that you upload in the quarter that the transfer is reported on the QIB. And lastly, that's pretty much all I had to say about incentive fund stuff. I just wanted to let you know that the Auditor's Health Insurance Form will be available again this year in the portal. It's will be available December 1st. You'll all be receiving an email generated through the portal saying it's now available for you to start preparing. It needs to be completed by January 15. And they will all be reviewed and approved by FQA no later than January 31st, so that that information is available for the 4D offices to start claiming health insurance for 2022. And that is all that we had, I think. Are there any questions? Here's our contact information that Joe talked about earlier. That's our financial quality assurance email address, as well as the one for Invest. Thank you very much.